When we think of immigration in the American Civil War, we first probably think of immigrants from places like Germany and Ireland, tens of thousands of whom fought in the conflict. We probably don't think of immigrants from Scotland as playing an important role in the American Civil War. And to be sure, far fewer Scots than Germans or Irish fought in the conflict. However, in my lecture today, I'm going to talk about Scotland in the American Civil War and make the argument that Scotland actually had a fairly large impact on the conflict, and that the American Civil War had a fairly substantial impact on Scotland itself. I've lived in Scotland now for 8 years, teaching at the University of Edinburgh, teaching about the American Civil War. And I've found through this time really profound and interesting connections between this defining conflict in American history and the country where I now live and teach. So a little bit about Scotland in the 19th century provides context. Scotland is part of the UK. It's a relatively small nation. It's about the size of South Carolina by point of comparison. But for a small nation, it had a fairly outsized impact on the world. Lots of Scots were traveling around the world. There is a global Scottish diaspora in the 18th and 19th century. Scots are traveling throughout the British Empire and participating in that empire in places like in Canada and India and Australia. There are also thousands of Scots who are immigrating to the United States. Scots are also in the midst of a intellectual and cultural renaissance in the century before the American Civil War. We think of figures like the philosopher David Hume, the economist Adam Smith, and especially important for the story I'm going to tell today, literary figures like the poet Robert Burns and the novelist Walter Scott, both of whom were tremendously important not only in Scotland, but around the world. They were global literary sensations and extraordinarily popular in the United States. Many Americans listed Robert Burns as their favorite poet. Abraham Lincoln could quote Burns from memory, as could many other Americans. Walter Scott's novels were the best-selling novels in the United States, among the best-selling novels anywhere. And his influence was so widespread that after the Civil War, Mark Twain famously blamed Walter Scott for the Civil War. He said, Sir Walter Scott, had such a large hand in making the Southern character as it existed before the war, that he is in great measure responsible for it. Now, Twain's joking there, but I think that sort of speaks to this impact that Walter Scott had. Among the Americans who was a great fan of both Robert Burns and Walter Scott was Frederick Douglass. In fact, Frederick Douglass took his name from a character in a Walter Scott poem. He abandoned the name of his enslaver when he ran away to freedom. He took the surname Douglas after the hero in Walter Scott's poem, Lady of the Lake. He also really loved the poetry of Robert Burns. The first book he bought as a free man was a volume of Burns's poetry, and he, like Lincoln, could quote Burns from memory, quoted him actually quite frequently in speeches. Douglas actually ends up visiting Scotland 3 times. The first is in 1846, 1 year after the publication of his famous memoir, his famous slave narrative. And he ends up in this trip spending 18 months in the UK and much of it in Scotland. Here we can see a map on the left of the various places that Douglas spoke in Britain during this trip. This is work done by my colleague, Hannah Rose Murray, who's done a really remarkable job of chronicling Douglas's travels there. And she has a great website where you can go and see the various places Douglas visited. Douglas had several reasons for making this trip in 1846. One is that his narrative was making him a public figure, and he was fearful that his former enslavers who still claimed legal ownership of him, which tried to seize him and bring him back into slavery. He also wanted to build connections with abolitionists in the UK, and build not only sort of social networks, but financial networks to continue his work in the United States. And you can see from Dr. Murray's map, he is traveling really throughout the UK, but is spending a great deal of time in Scotland. And in fact, he ends up living based in Edinburgh for much of his time here in the UK. The map on the right shows places in Edinburgh where where Frederick Douglas is connected. You can see a number of locations there where he spoke. You can also see down here at the bottom of the map the place where he lived during his time here in Edinburgh. I actually live basically around the corner from that. The site of his home has actually recently been commemorated by a plaque. This is largely the work of the consequence of the work of one of my colleagues, Celeste Marie Bernier, who is a Douglas scholar. You can see her there at the unveiling of the plaque a couple of years ago. I'm also there in the background. And Douglas does a number of things during his time in Scotland. He obviously gives speeches about slavery in the United States. He gives dozens and dozens of speeches to packed audiences. He was a riveting speaker, and Scots were extraordinarily interested in what he had to say. And he spoke not only about slavery in the United States, but he also spoke out about local issues. And one local issue that attracted his attention was the Free Church of Scotland. Free Church of Scotland was a new religious denomination, a breakaway from the Presbyterian Church that had recently been formed. The Free Church of Scotland had sent missionaries to the American South to help raise money to help build their church. And much of the money they raised was from slave owners, built on the work of enslaved people. Frederick Douglass led a campaign to send back the money. That was the campaign slogan, to send back this money that was ill-gotten. Here we see a letter from Frederick Douglass to William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist leader, publisher of The Liberator, about the Free Church campaign. Garrison is actually also in the UK at this time. Like many American abolitionists, he spends time on both sides of the Atlantic. Douglas makes a second trip to the UK in 1859 in the aftermath of John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry. Douglas and John Brown were close associates. There were fears after the raid that Frederick Douglass would be punished for his connections to John Brown. So he returns to the UK and to Scotland for the better part of a year, but then ends up returning to the United States when he learns in a letter that his daughter had died. Douglas is only one of many American abolitionists, both white and black abolitionists, who spend time in Scotland. Here we see images of many of them. You see William Lloyd Garrison down there in the bottom right. In the bottom left is Josiah Henson, who is famous for being the inspiration for Harry Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Just to point out some of the others, Ellen and William Craft were an enslaved couple in Georgia. They had a rather ingenious way of escaping from slavery. Ellen Craft was very light-skinned, and so she disguised herself as an elderly white man, and her husband William disguised himself as that elderly white man's servant. And in this ruse, they boarded a train north to freedom and spent a large amount of time in Scotland once they had escaped from bondage. And these American abolitionists are connecting with Scottish abolitionists. Many slave narratives are republished in Scotland, and they, like Frederick Douglass, attracted very large audiences. And so the Scots were very well informed about affairs in the United States. There are also African Americans visiting Scotland for other reasons. One figure who is gaining a lot more attention in recent years but has previously been somewhat neglected is this man, James McCune Smith, who is an extraordinarily interesting figure. He was born in New York City, wants to become a physician, but can't find a medical school in the United States that will accept him. So he goes to the University of Glasgow, where he receives a medical degree in 1837. He then returns to the United States and becomes a prominent Black intellectual. He runs an orphanage in New York City. He runs a pharmacy and a medical practice. He runs a newspaper. He does a little bit of everything, but a really important figure that is only recently getting the attention he deserves. The University of Glasgow is actually in the process of building a new building that they will name after him. When the war breaks out in 1861, it is very heavily covered in the Scottish press. Civil War stories are front page news, and they cover events very, very closely. And like the rest of Britain, Scotland is divided in their sympathies in the American Civil War. On the one hand, many Scots saw themselves as abolitionists, were sympathetic to the Union cause, sympathetic in the fight against slavery. On the other hand, the Scottish economy, like the economy of much of the rest of Britain, was connected to textile manufacturing. Many of the textile mills in Scotland were built upon cotton grown by enslaved labor in the American South. And what one finds then is both pro-slavery and pro-Confederate sentiment in some Scottish publications and pro-Union sentiment in others. Thousands of Scots and people descended of Scottish ancestry fight in the American Civil War. For the most part, Scots fight in regiments integrated with other Americans in both the Union and the Confederacy, although you do have a handful of quote unquote Scottish regiments, especially in the Union Army. Probably the most famous is the 79th New York, depicted here. This is a regiment that began as a militia company in 1859 called the Highland Guard. It was established by the Caledonian and St. Andrews Societies in New York. And like most of these antebellum militia companies, it was as much a sort of social organization as it was a military one. But in 1861, it becomes folded into the Union Army as the 79th New York. They end up fighting at Bull Run. They're in William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade, and there they take some of the heaviest casualties of any of the Union forces there. The colonel of the regiment, a man by the name of James Cameron, who was the brother of Secretary of War Simon Cameron, he ends up dying in the battle, as did many of the men in the regiment. In the aftermath of Bull Run, the 79th New York was sent to help build fortifications around Washington, D.C. They were pretty unhappy about this, so unhappy, in fact, that many of the men in the 79th mutinied in August of 1861. They had several objections. They didn't like the labor they were doing. They didn't like the fact they didn't get to select their new commanding officer. They didn't like the fact that they were not being allowed to return to New York. They wanted to go home and visit, and they had enlisted for 3 years. The men who had enlisted for 3 months had all gone home, and they felt they deserved passes to return home at least briefly, and those were denied. General George McClellan, who himself is of Scottish descent, put down this mutiny pretty heavily. He ended up sending 21 of the ringleaders into military prison. The regiment managed to redeem itself somewhat. In 1862, they took part in the Port Royal invasion, and that year they participated in many of the important battles in the Eastern Theater, including Second Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. In 1863, they were sent into the West, where they participated in the Vicksburg campaign. In 1864, they come back east. They're in the Overland campaign. They're at the Wilderness, and it's Spotsylvania. And after that, they are mustered out when their 3 years are up. But at this point, only 130 of the original regiment were left. I should point out that they're depicted here in wearing traditional Scottish military garb. You will actually find that many Scottish soldiers during the Civil War are depicted that way. It doesn't seem as if many of them actually fought in combat in kilts. A lot of it was for parades, although we do have some evidence that at least a few of them did fight in this traditional Scottish military uniform. There were other Scottish regiments or Scottish units in the Union Army. The Highland Guard of Chicago, for instance, was captained by John MacArthur, and you can see him pictured there, who was born near Glasgow. And the Highland Guard of Chicago formed the nucleus of the 12th Illinois Infantry, which is also sometimes called the 1st Scotch Regiment. And they ended up fighting at Stones River and at Fort Donelson. There's also the 65th Illinois, which is sometimes called the 2nd Scotch Regiment, which is organized in 1862, led by a man by the name of Daniel Cameron, another good Scottish name. They end up fighting at Harper's Ferry during the Atlantic campaign, the March to the Sea. Now, there were lots of Union generals who were of Scottish descent, had Scottish names, Grant, McClellan, McDowell, McPherson, what have you. But there is one Union general who was actually Scottish by birth, and that is James Geddes, who was born in Edinburgh in 1827. And he's a really interesting example of the Scottish global diaspora. He's born in Edinburgh. His family moves when he's young to Canada. He then returns to Scotland for some education. He then moves to India as part of the British Army. He ends up fighting in India there. He fights in the first Anglo-African or Anglo-Afghan War. He then returns to Canada, serves in the Canadian cavalry for a while, but ends up marrying an American woman, and he moves to Iowa where he becomes a farmer. And it's while he's a farmer and a teacher in Iowa that the Civil War breaks out, and he joins the 8th Iowa Infantry, originally as a private, but then very quickly, because of his military experience, works his way up the ranks. He is wounded captured at Shiloh. The monument there is of the 8th Iowa at Shiloh. He's later paroled and exchanged, and fighting at Vicksburg and in the Mobile campaign. And by the end of the war, he had been promoted to the rank of brigadier general. After the war, he returns to Iowa, where he is, at least for a time, the acting president of Iowa State University. You also have immigrants from Scotland fighting in the Confederate Army. One of the more interesting of them is a man by the name of William Watson, who was born near Glasgow. His father was a gardener on a large estate. William Watson didn't want to be a gardener, so he moves to Bermuda, and then he moves to Louisiana in 1850. And by 1860, he was moderately wealthy. He owned part of a sawmill and a steamboat company. He was opposed to secession, but ends up joining the Confederate Army in 1861. He fights a number of battles, Wilson's Creek, Corinth. And at Corinth, he ends up getting wounded and captured. He's later paroled and discharged because of his injury. but he wants to continue to contribute to the Confederate cause, so he takes up blockade running. Blockade running was really important for the Confederate economy. The Union blockade stopped both the export of textiles, of cotton, and the import of all kinds of needed war material. So William Watson gets involved in blockade running. He gets a ship. You can see it there pictured in the middle, the SS Rob Roy, which he named after the famous Scottish outlaw and folk hero, and he runs supplies from Cuba and Bermuda into Texas. After the war, he returns to Scotland, where he ends up living near Glasgow, and he writes a couple of books about his experience. The first, Life in the Confederate Army in 1888, and the second, The Civil War Adventures of a Blockade Runner in 1892. Blockade running was one area in which Scots are very heavily involved in the Civil War. Many of these ships that are used in the blockade were built in Scotland, especially in Glasgow. One historian estimated that by 1864, there were 27 different shipyards in Glasgow, employing some 25,000 men, building these ships designed for running the Union blockade. And not only are Scots heavily involved in building these ships, but they are also sometimes sailing them as well. Some from the order of 3,000 Scots are working as sailors on these ships. Technically, Britain is neutral during the Civil War, although there are a whole variety of ways in which British, and in this case Scottish, sailors and laborers are involved in the conflict. It's not only Scottish men who are involved in the Civil War, but also Scottish women. One of the more interesting is Kate Cummings, who was born in Edinburgh. Her family moves to Canada and then to Alabama. And she's, throughout her life, strongly identified both as a Scot and as a Southerner. At the start of the Civil War, her mother and sisters returned to the UK, but Kate decided to stay in Alabama with her father, while her brother joined the Confederate Army. And over the objections of her family, she volunteered to work as a nurse, tending to soldiers at Corinth and at Chattanooga. She published her diary in 1866 as a journal of hospital life in the Confederate Army. And this is really one of our best sources for understanding the experience of Confederate nurses. She also became one of the founding mothers of the Lost Cause, defending the Confederacy and the Confederate cause for the next 40 years of her life. She vocally objected, for instance, to the trial of Henry Wirz, the commandant of the Andersonville prison, who was executed for his treatment of prisoners. And she became one of the founders of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Alabama. While Cummings remained in the United States after the Civil War, many Scots who fought in the conflict returned to Scotland. And one of the ways in which we know this is we've got some pension records from 1883. I'm reliant here on the work of my colleague Damian Shields, who has done some really extraordinary work on pension records. And he's found over 30 Union veterans who are in Scotland who are collecting a pension in 1883. This is probably only a small fraction of the Scots who have returned to Scotland at this point. In order to get a pension, you had to not only apply for a pension, and many veterans didn't, but you also had to demonstrate that you were significantly wounded in the war in order to be eligible for a pension. And you can see from this map showing the locations of where these pensions are filed from throughout Scotland, but especially in the central belt around Glasgow and Edinburgh. It's one of these returning Scots that leads to the creation of this monument here, one of the more interesting symbols of the American Civil War in Scotland, the Scottish American Civil War Monument. The story behind this monument starts with John McEwen, whose name you can see there on the monument itself and in the picture. McEwen was born in Scotland, had gone off and moved to the United States, fought for the Union, returns to Scotland, has a family, but dies in poverty. And his widow goes to the U.S. consulate and tries to see if she can get a pension for herself and for their children. She ends up meeting with the consul's wife and eventually with the consul. The consul was a man by the name of Wallace Bruce, which is the most Scottish name ever. He's actually from New York, but of Scottish descent. Bruce hears her story and decides to go and help her with the pension, but also decides to build a monument to the Scots who fought in the American Civil War. He goes and raises money in New York to help build this monument. He gets money from Andrew Carnegie, who himself is Scottish, but also people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Rockefellers. And in August of 1893, they dedicate this monument depicted here. The sculpture itself was made in the United States by a man named George Bissell, who specialized in making Civil War monuments. The marble there, the stonework is all Scottish. That lists the names of a handful of soldiers, some of whom are actually buried on the site. It's a very interesting monument. It depicts, as you can see, Abraham Lincoln holding the Emancipation Proclamation. And below Lincoln is a formerly enslaved person who has now been emancipated. You can see that if you look closely, the formerly enslaved person is holding a book, a symbol of his education and of his freedom. There's also a military hat next to him, which suggests that he may have also served in the Union Army. This monument, I think, is inspired at least in part by the Emancipation Memorial in DC, which was dedicated a decade and a half earlier, which has a similar kind of composition. And it highlights the connection between Lincoln and emancipation. And in fact, if you could look closely, the words below Lincoln's feet is the word emancipation, highlighting that connection between Scotland and the abolitionist movement and Lincoln and the war. In addition to soldiers from Scotland who returned to Scotland in the post-war period, many other figures associated with the Civil War visit Scotland during Reconstruction and afterwards. Jefferson Davis, for instance, visits Scotland 3 times in the late 1860s and early 1870s. This, of course, is after his capture in 1865 and his imprisonment. After he's released, he travels a variety of places, but especially he spends a lot of time in Scotland. He travels throughout Scotland. He spends time in Glasgow. That's where the picture in the upper left is taken. He goes to Edinburgh. He travels throughout the Highlands. He goes out to the islands. One of the places he visits is Fingal's Cave, which is this really amazing geological formation on an island in the west of Scotland. And everywhere he goes, he is recognized, and this is in part because of how closely the American Civil War was covered in the Scottish press. In fact, there's only one time in which Davis was not recognized, and that was by a shepherd in the remote Highlands, who, when he's introduced to Davis as the former president of the Southern Confederacy, the shepherd asked whether that was based in London or not. But I think that sort of speaks to how most Scots were familiar with events in the States. Ulysses S. Grant also visits Scotland. He does this as part of his world tour post-presidency, which he does from 1877 to 1879. He's the first former president to visit Scotland. Grant himself is of Scottish descent on both sides of his family. And so was very excited to visit Scotland, and Scotland was very excited to see him. He spends 3 weeks in Scotland, at times in Glasgow, and Inverness and Edinburgh. Huge crowds come to see him. wherever he goes. At one point, Grant complains that his arm was sore from shaking so many hands. And Grant was a real student of Scottish history and culture. He had read Walter Scott's novels to his wife when they were courting. He could quote Burns from memory. He made a pilgrimage to Scott's home and to the town of Stirling, famous for its connections to Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. He was invited while he was in Scotland by the Duke of Sutherland to go and hunt a Highland stag, which is something people do when they visit Scotland. The Duke, I think, wanted to hang the stag's head on the wall of his castle with Grant's name attached to it, but Grant declined. He said he didn't like hunting very much. We've got some great accounts of Grant's time in Scotland. There's in fact a book that was published by a journalist who accompanied Grant. And here we see some illustrations of Grant's visit to Edinburgh. And you can see the city hasn't actually changed very much from the time of Grant's visits. Here is an image from the top of Calton Hill. You can see the Edinburgh castle there in the background. Here's another image from that book. From the grass market looking up at Edinburgh Castle, and a relatively similar image taken more recently. Frederick Douglass makes one final visit to Scotland. This he does in 1886, 20 years after the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery. He does this ostensibly as a honeymoon with his second wife, Helen Pitts. You can see her seated next to him, and that's Helen's sister standing in the background. And even though this was in theory a pleasure trip, he did a series of lectures and interviews while in Scotland during their trip, in which he highlighted the gains that African Americans had made since the Civil War and emancipation, but also highlighting the continued struggles that they had against racism in the United States. The connections between Scotland and the United States are as present, I think, today as they ever have been. As evidence of this, I want to point out a mural that appeared just a few months ago in September of 2020 on the side of a building not far from the house where Frederick Douglass lived when he was here. And I heard on the news only earlier this week that they are planning a musical to talk, the subject of which is Douglass's life in Scotland and experiences in Scotland. All of which is to say that Scotland and the American Civil War have really profound connections, connections that continue even to this day.